And hello everyone, welcome back to another nim tutorial. In this tutorial we will be continuing on the try and except in nim. Alright, so let's create our own exception. So currently we have pre-built exceptions, which are basically like the IO error, the OS error, all of these that we're trying, and then except, and the type of error as E, whatnot. But we can actually raise our own custom exception. Such as if we were to say try, then here if we go IO error as E, then here we can actually raise. In other languages, this might be called throw in custom error or a custom exception. So we say raise new exception, and here we just say what exception we are inheriting from. So this will basically be, let's say it's a custom version of an input-output error. So we want to inherit from that error. So IO error. And here we can just say custom IO failed error message. Then here we could of course echo out in IO error has occurred. And we can of course just e.msg. Here we go. Now if we were to run this, we'll get an IO error has occurred custom IO failed error message. So here we're throwing our own IO error, but also giving it a custom message. So this is like our own custom exception that we're throwing. So whenever an IO error is thrown and we raised one here, then it will pop up here and we can manage it however we need. Now you can also specify what type of error should be thrown in a function or a procedure. So we go procedure throw error, and then we ask, do you want to throw an IO error? If not, we'll default to an OS error. We say boolean, and in here we can actually, and this is primarily just if you're creating a library and basically someone else will use your code, or if you want to make your code more readable in the future, this pragma, which is this attribute we're adding to the end of this procedure, which we'll get to more in depth later. But this pragma will allow us to specify what errors this procedure may throw, such as raises, and we say colon, and in this array here, we specify the types of error. In our case, either an IO error or an OS error. And then finally, we actually go to the procedure. So that's how it would look if it didn't wrap my text. Then here we can say if they passed in IO error, then we raise a new exception. We say it is of type IO error, and we just specify IO error was raised. And then of course we can say else raise new exception OS error with the same type of error message and then OS. Now of course we can try this and we can say try, and first let's try and go IO error, and we say throw error true. We can catch this error as E, and we can echo out e.msg except, and here we can just say OS error. Now if we were to run this, we get IO error was raised. If this were to be false, we would get an OS error. Now note, when you specify these here, you can still run normal code. These are just the errors it might throw. For example, let's just say it might throw an OS error. In that case, we can maybe just go here. Yeah, that's fine. If IO error, it will throw in, or not IO, we can just say error. There we go. So if we specify an error, then we can just print out or throw this OS error. Otherwise, we can just return cool, no error. And of course here we can just specify it will return a string. And if we throw the error, let's say false, and let's echo that out. And then we can of course catch an OS error. If we run this, we'll get cool, no error was thrown. However, we do know this function may throw an OS error. So if we were to say true here, we can run this and we'll get an error that was raised. If we were to do this, which is, I think it's this by default, but if we were to do this, it means that no error will actually be thrown here by us. It might be thrown by a different function happening inside of this function. So let's say this reads a file, and all this does is it calls the read file method. And when it calls it, that read file method might throw an error. Let's say you get an error of authentication because you're not allowed to read the file. Then you might get an IO error. Let's say we say raise new exception, and we specify an OS error. And we say OS error. Now here we get an can raise an unlisted exception because we have this here. If we were to specify OS error here and save, we will not get this issue. But because we specify that we will not be raising any errors like this, we are getting this error because it says, hey, you cannot do this. You cannot say that. So if we try to run this, we'll actually get, you cannot do this. We'll get a big error. But take note, not all errors are created equal. You also have some defects, such as the div by 0 defect. If you were to raise this, it will not throw an error, or it will not see this as an error. The reason for this is because if we were to try and do something like this, let's just say discard, meaning throw away the value we get here. We don't really care about the value, we just want to run it. Then div 0. Now if the user passed in a value in here, I'll also remove this. And it was not 10 divided by 0, it was 10 divided by the value the user passed in. This is a defect instead of an error because we cannot know why this error or when this error will occur. So in this case, we will just get a normal error, but we will not be forced to not run this. As you can see, we get an execution, we get an error here, but it was during runtime. And here it says div by 0 defect. So that is what's happening here. We can of course prevent this by putting our own try and except here. So try doing this, except div by 0 defect, return failed, otherwise return passed. Now if we were to run this here, it would just say fail. Now this is somewhat in the form of your custom error, but it's more like just throwing an error. If you really want to create your own custom error, let's get into that. We can go type, so we're specifying a new type we want to define. Let's say custom error. And this is of type object, or not type, it is equal to type object of exception. This is the same as what we had in the OOP tutorial, almost same as that. In this case, we are extending this exception here. So we're creating our own custom exception that extends exception. So here we have two custom errors, but you'll notice if we go here, it says inherit from more precise exception, like a value error, IO error, OS error. So we could just put this OS error here. So that then you're inheriting from a more specific error in a specific place. The reason you might want to do this is if your error is related to an already existing error, but just differentiates a little bit, it's better to do this because an exception is everything. An exception is every exception imaginable. So it's not a great idea to inherit from specifically exception. But for this tutorial scenario, let's just do that. Then here we can have var c is equal to, let's say, 2. Then we'll go try. And here we can say if c is equal to 1, raise new exception. We throw our custom error here. And this is my custom error. There we go. Then we can say elif c is equal to 2. We can raise our second custom error. In this case, it might say OS error, but for our scenario, it doesn't really matter what it says here. And we just say 2 here. And then of course, we can just say else. And we just raise a normal input-output error. Then here we can catch specific errors that we created. Now you can give your own little name for these errors that is more descriptive than custom, such as C not equal error or something like that. But then we can say custom error as E, or in this case, let's go a little bit back here, custom error 2 as E, just so we can have a little bit of variety here. And then we can just use normal except. Then here we can echo custom error. Here we can echo e.msg. And in here we can just echo all other errors. There we go. So this is just an example of creating your own custom error by inheriting from an already existing exception. And here we're just again going through the basics, so you can just accept specifically without no message. You can accept, but then save it in a variable, and then you can accept, and it will just throw everything else in that accept. Now when we run this, then here we get this is my custom error 2. If we were to make this equal to 1, of course we'll get our custom error, and if we were to make it equal to 3 or anything else, then we'll get that IO error. Alright, and finally, let's take a look. This is not really error handling that much, but it does something very similar to it. Let's look at defer. Now this is a very popular feature in some other programming languages, and I personally love using it in a lot of places. Now take note, defer cannot be used on the top level, so it needs to be inside some sort of function to be able to be used. So it needs to be indented somewhere. So let's say procedure defs for defer. And here, let's say we try and open our users.txt file, the one right here. Let's say we try and open that in append mode. So var d is equal to open users.txt in fm append mode. And in here we say d.write JSON. Okay, there we go. Now the issue with this is we forgot to close D. This is something that happens very often, and we need to close it. So let's go here and say close D. But now we have another issue. What if during the write process, this right here failed? Then D would never get closed and freed from memory. What do we do then? Well, what we could do is we could throw this in a try and accept, so try, and we'll try to do this. And then finally, we say close D. But what we could do instead of this is we move close here and just say defer close D. Now what defer here will do is everything we just showed you. It will write that try and finally for you. So if an error happens, close D will run before that error stops the program. And of course we can test this out by going defs. And if we run this, let's run this. Okay, it seemed to work. If we were to take a look here, then we get hello in JSON. And that's that for exception handling in nim. Also, if you want to increase your nim skills, maybe make it a little bit better, every week we are having a challenge on my Discord, link in the description, where we have these basic challenges. They'll get more difficult over time, but if you want to improve your nim skills or any other programming language skills, feel free to come over to my Discord and participate in these coding challenges. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all again in the next nim tutorial.